I have 21, 1 through 11 as a single bracket. And this is the law of the servants or slaves. And there's things about this that will only make sense if you actually systematically study it. So here's what I want you to do. As I'm looking at the civil code, I want you to think, God is commanding my older brother Israel, telling my older brother what they should be like, so that I might learn from that. So these are not laws I think you need to keep. They're not things you need to do. But by examining them, you have the ability to see things that make your father happy. Okay? Are we all on that page? Now, what I'm looking for are some societal standards of civility. And when I get in here, I want to look at what am I responsible for and what am I not? Let me tell you in the background of 21 what my key principle is. God's intention was to build a society based on personal responsibility, community protection, individual freedoms, and societal boundaries. What I mean by that is that God intended to mark out a society that was going to both protect the people, but also protect individual rights. Okay? So when there's a breach of individual rights, it violates the societal standards God is looking for. Too much talk. Let's go right into the very beginning. In 21, when we start off, you know what? I think probably the smart way to do this, I'm going to skip 1 to 11 and come back to it after 12. And the reason I'm going to do that is I think it's going to be easier to handle the problems involved in the slave culture after I handle some of the other laws. When you build a legal system, you have foundational things and then the caveats or the modifications to them. And so let me go to 2:12 first, and then I'll come back and do 1 to 11, okay? Drop 2:12 to 17, and these are death penalty cases. Can you put death penalty cases there in 12 to 17? And it says, he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. Now, he's going to modify this. It's not everybody who strikes a man so that he dies is put to death. That's how chapter 21 verse 12 reads, but you've got to keep reading to understand what it is he's saying. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint you a place to which he may flee. What did he just say? I'm swinging a bat. Someone else walks out into the line of the bat. I didn't see them. It hits them in the head and it kills them. That's not premeditated murder. It's what we would call manslaughter. It is an accidental death, okay? Premeditated murder is I am mad at them, so I got the bat, went over and hit them in the head until they were dead. That's a different standard of law. So verse 12 then offers a standard of law, but verse 13 modifies it and says, now if you happen to be involved in a manslaughter case, God will give you a place where you can go that is like a safe place. A place where you can go and wait so that no one can judge you outright. Because otherwise, if you premeditatedly murdered, we could just kill you because you killed him. That would be right. Now, you shall not murder does not include then in the statute the state taking the life of the person who murdered. Because in fact, they're going to be told to do that. So it's not murder if God says this is the appropriate person to do it. Does that make sense? In war, you're not murdering the other person. You're killing them. There's a difference. In the one system, you're out there premeditatedly murdering them, and that is not a state-sponsored or action. In the other one, it's the guy who actually throws the switch at the death penalty on the electric chair is not murdering the other individual. He's killing them. But he has a state sanction to do that based on what the law provided. So we don't throw that guy in jail and in turn kill him and then kill the guy who killed him and then kill the guy who killed him. You know, that's not what we do, okay? Verse 14. If, however, a man acts presumptuously toward his neighbor, so as to kill him craftily, you are to take him even from my altar that he may die. So, in 2:12 and 13 and 14, the standard is premeditated murder. If you plotted to kill, it's a violation of Standard 6, the sanctity of human life, and you are not to find a place to hide. If it was accidental death, that's a different situation. But if it was intentional death, there is to be no way for you to have premeditatedly murdered somebody else and yet live. Is that clear? Now, this doesn't mean you have to do this. This means this should inform how God thinks. So, what's the bigger principle here? It's not just premeditated murder. It's that some people should be removed from society immediately, out of the game for the duration. Because if you let them continue, you are going to increase the number of people that this is going to continue to happen to. Let me say this, verse 15. There's a second standard. The first standard was premeditated murder, which is a death penalty case. The second standard is it offends people in the modern university. But to strike or curse a parent was a death penalty case. Look at what it says in verse 15. He who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. If you go all the way to verse 17, he who curses his father or mother shall surely be put to death. In Standard 5, in the honoring of parents, the penalty protected them from both physical and verbal attack. God held the family unit as absolutely essential to the success of the society. And so he said, you cannot treat it that way. The third one is in verse 16, and that's this kidnapping someone. The Bible says that he who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. Now, both standards 8 and 9, that is the theft and the false witness standard, are both being breached here. Now, when they find him in his possession, we don't mean that it's the cop driving the person back to the station after he set them free. That's not what we mean. We mean a person who is being held over by a person who's lying about the fact that they're there. So society is supposed to protect life. Society is supposed to honor the family. Society is supposed to ensure a swift penalty. Here's what I'm trying to say. In the value system of God, a swift penalty is absolutely essential to the keeping of a society on track. So, look at the three things that we've seen in death penalty cases God says he values. He says, I value these three things. I value the sacredness of human life. I also value respect for someone else's freedom or individual freedom, respected. And what's the third one? The third one is respect for positions placed by God. There are some Christians running around that will suggest things like, well, the Bible says thou shalt not kill, and Jesus stood up against the execution of the adulterous woman. You remember Jesus is sitting there in John 8, and he's drawing on the floor in the temple, and somebody comes in and throws down a woman, and they said this woman was caught in adultery, and he said, let him who is without sin cast the first stone, and they all went away, and then he turned to her and said, go and sin no more. Some people read that as though Jesus was against the death penalty. Was he? No. What's that? He's the one who wrote it. So how is it that he wrote it here but told her that didn't make them kill her? Because what's that? He didn't condemn her. How does that work? Yeah, it all comes down to an understanding of the law. In the law, the person who casts the first stone is the wounded party. They're the ones who bring testimony against them, and they're the ones who cast the first stone. So here's the situation. Here's a woman, but he looks around and he doesn't see the husband, or if he sees the husband, he knows that the husband's involved in the same sin she is. In other words, he's sleeping around, so she's caught doing this, and he's saying, yes, you can go ahead and stone her, but not if you're also doing it. Because if you're involved in it, we're stoning 2 people today, not 1. I will not allow my word to be used to be unjust against one and let the other go free. That's not going to happen. So he says, okay, go ahead and stone, but let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Not, well, everybody's a sinner, so she should get off of adultery. That's how people read it, and that's not what it says. the guy who's standing here, if he's also doing this, drop your rock. Because we're not killing her without killing you. The point is that the law, when used inequitably, is no longer the law of God. It's now a man using it to beat someone else. Does that make sense? Jesus didn't say, by the way, I'm absolutely for killing at Sinai and against killing when he showed up in Jerusalem. He'd said, I didn't come to reverse the law. I need you to understand that he says that it's an individual. So somebody tell me, turn your Bible to Matthew 5, 38 and 39 and apply the standard of the death penalty to Matthew 5, 38 and 39.
You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also.
There are Mennonite Christians who say because of that, they will not defend property or family. They believe that the death penalty is wrong. What's the difference between God saying it's okay for a state to take the life of someone if they violate a certain law, and Jesus telling his followers to forgive those who hurt you? What's the difference between those two things? You ready to jump in?
Well, okay. The first one in the state case, it's like a law that's been set up by the land that they're going against. If they're stealing your property, that's against the law. This is like, oh, someone slapped you or they harmed you more emotional.
Mm-hmm.
Turn the other cheek, forgive them. It's not necessarily saying, they are beating up your child and you can't go defend your kid. That's something more legally.
Okay, the legal system is imposed on the entire society and is equally imposed. Individual forgiveness is an individual issue. So Jesus is not saying governments need to forgive everybody who's wrong, or parking tickets would be a violation of Jesus' teaching. You just need to forgive. See, that's the lack of logic. That Christian is running around going, well, we can't have a death penalty. You can't have a parking ticket if everybody has to forgive everybody who's done something wrong to them, and that means the state does too. You can't have laws based on that. There should be no penalty for any law of any kind because that violates forgiveness. No, forgiveness is an individual property. Recompense is a state property. These aren't the same thing. That's why murder is an individual property, but war is a state property. It's recompensed in a different way. There are laws for war. God's going to make some. He's going to tell you can't poison the well of your enemy. You can't salt their fields when you've conquered them. There are things you can't do. But that doesn't mean you can't kill them. You can, because you will be forced to. Okay? So what I'm trying to say is that we have to divide out in our own thinking what is corporately derived and what is individually derived. Does that make sense? So in the law, when the law has a corporate law or a national law or a civil code that is supposed to be equally applied to all people, that's one thing. Individual laws within it may be, you should forgive the guy when they send him to the electric chair. If he wounded you, individually as a follower of Jesus, I forgive him. State-wise, we execute him. There's no disharmony between those two things. One is corporate, one is individual. Let me make the argument that if you don't, as a Christian, forgive him, even though he is killed, you will still carry bitterness, and he will still have power over your life, even though he is dead. So you are required to forgive him. All right, now let's do this. Let's go back now and take a look at the bondservant laws and see if now, with some of that background, we can't look at one of the more basic standards for civil society. One of the places civility breaks down is unregulated in the workplace. I want to go to the workplace for a minute. Now, verse 2 of chapter 21 says, if you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years. But on the 7th, he shall go out as a free man without payment. That means without him having to pay to get free. It doesn't mean he doesn't get payment. It means he doesn't have to pay to go free. Are we all there? Okay, focus on this one because it's going to be tough to grab if your mind is wandering. Verse 3, if he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he's the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife of her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man. Then his master shall bring him to God. Then he shall bring him to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. The beginning of the earring was a symbol of slavery. That's what it was. Now, does the Bible support slavery here? The charge in every university I go to is the Bible didn't even have anything against slavery. Does the Bible support slavery here? We are intrinsically knowing that the Bible has respect for individual freedom. That you can't kidnap and make subservient someone. We've already seen that. So how does one get a slave? How can it be that God supports? I want to do something that's going to put you back in time, because the big problem here is every university student can get all indignant about this because they refuse to look at it from the perspective of the person living several thousand years ago. I want you to understand that the whole thing has to do with contract relationships in work life. Why? Well, you got to remember something. I know that what we see when we see the word slave is antebellum plantation life with black people being put in nets, dragged across the sea, and put in a southern plantation and having their back beaten into cotton work. That's not what he's talking about. How do I know? Because it's wrong to kidnap anyone. He already said that. And that's how that slavery developed. Kidnapped Africans became the backbone of the slavery movement. Second, the southern slaves were permanent. And verse 2 here says you can't have a permanent slave. So what they're talking about is not the slavery. What they're talking about is more like a modern worker on the Alaskan pipeline or a Gulf oil platform. What they're talking about is the indentured service of somebody who's taken from their family and put out in the middle of the ocean on an oil platform. They don't get to be with their family. They don't get to see their How many of you have seen one of those Discovery Channel fishing shows or crab shows where those guys go out there and they're out there for a couple of months and their life is in peril? And okay, it's more like that. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about a type or system of employment. The thing you have to understand is the Bible never supported the slavery like the pre-war South had before the Civil War in the United States. That is not at all what we're talking about. This is a business model. And what I want you to understand is God's society was supposed to be based on civility that understood certain business contractual models. What he's working here... 10 generations, these people have only been slaves. They have never thought outside of slavery. Listen, when you think as a slave, what is the only thing you have to make a living off of? Your labor. So, your labor. Ladies, your ability to bear children was one of the labors for which people paid. They paid for the use of your body to have babies because they needed the baby. One of the labors, gentlemen, you could do is go out there and till a field or work the sheep or care for the camels. They did this because your labor was all you had. You are in a society, I want to put you back in that time. You're in a society where people are destitute, where they've got nothing to barter or trade. Nothing. All they have is the work of their hands. Now, look at the properties of these verses with something in mind. There is nothing else these people have. So God creates a system with a group of people who have been slaves for generations who think as slaves. And he says, let me tell you how to get from the slavery system to a system of capital. Okay? And he says this. First, I want to make a length of the term. What is the length of the term? Okay, 6 years, and you cannot keep him the 7th year. He can sign on to stay with your family and get an earring. But you can't make him stay longer than that. And during that time, he is able to build up wealth that he can take with him. Okay? You don't get to take everything from him and leave him bankrupt. So this is a way for, in 6 years, for him to go out on the oil platform and work for 6 years and come away with a lot of cash. To go out for 6 months on the fish boat and come away with lots of cash. That's the idea here. The idea isn't you get to beat his back. That's not what he's trying to do. He's trying to say there are conditions of length and conditions of severance. What's the severance condition? What does it say about him leaving?
He shall go out alone.
And if he came alone,
If he came alone, if he had a wife, he is allowed to take her, but if his master gave him a wife, he's not allowed.
now, what's the difference there? Why would it be fair for him to have come, his master gave him a wife, but he doesn't get to keep her? He goes out alone. Why is that fair?
Because his master gave it to him, so it's not his.
His master gave it to him, and he's not stuck with having to provide for something he can't provide for that he didn't choose to get. Isn't that fair? I mean, how does that protect the woman?
She won't be in poverty if he can't afford it.
Exactly. So the master who was able to afford her, who does keep food on her plate, will not force her to go out the door with someone who can't keep food on her plate where she starves. See, I want to turn this around so you see it differently. This is a system that was designed to protect the weaker person, not to beat them. Antebellum slavery in the South was provided to keep that guy the level of a mule. That's not what this is. This is to get the guy from starting from slavery to becoming a person who has something. This is more the sharecropping arrangement to create wealth and never let people be forced into taking on responsibilities they can't afford. Okay? Does that help? Because you're going to be sitting in classrooms where people are going to be saying, well, your God supports slavery. No, my God inherited 10 generations of slaves and turned it around and turned them into a free society. That's what he did. And just because the word servant, slave is used does not, let me tell you something. The guy who's on that boat who's up at 3 o'clock in the morning picking up those crabs looks every bit like a slave. But the fact is he is his own person. And so are these people. They're not owned, they're cared for. And there's a difference. By the way, look at the retention conditions. If the servant decides to stay on, what can he do? He can get his ear pierced. He can personally, publicly state that he wants to be. He cannot be forced into it. He can invite himself into it. And many, many people did. They'd rather stay on with employment and have food on the table and have the family relationship that they've built up over those years than walk out and have nothing. And for many of them, if they feel like they're not able to do this on their own, or they feel like they're insufficiently prepared, they may want to stay on. Or if they frankly just love the people and want to stay there, they can do that. This was a way of creating a family system out of a slave system. It's one of the things it did. Now, I want to look at the parameters of discipline because one of the places that this shows up is in the discipline area. So go to 21:20 for a minute and drop your eyes down to the, if a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. Now, I want to stop right there and go, okay, wait a minute. Why isn't he killed? Because it was understood that the man may need to bring discipline to the person who's working for him. And you go, well, that's not right. No, you have to understand something. These people have only been slaves. They don't work with independent energy. They're not always energetic on the job. And so one of the things they had to be able to do was to discipline them to do the job. I'm not saying that somebody goes out there and beats them with a lash until they're bleeding. It's counterproductive to hurt your own people. Go out there and kick your computer. It's not going to help it. If you kick the things that are working for you, it's not going to help them. He's not doing this to say it's okay to beat your slaves. That's not what he's doing. He's saying, Verse 21, if, however, he survives a day or two, no vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property. During the time he works for you, he is under your care, but he's also under your charge. You have the right to expect him to do. Why did they do that? Because let's say you have a tent camp and you have 10 tents with different groups of people, and you're building an industry, and these guys shear the sheep, and these guys are the shepherds, and those guys make the cheese, and those guys weave the wool, and you've got a whole thing. You're building a factory here. What do you do if everybody can just look at you and say, we're not doing it today? We're just not shearing sheep today. We're just going to let them all be shaggy. We're not shearing sheep. You know what? We don't feel like making cheese today. Let all the milk go bad. We're just not doing it. There has to be a system whereby the person who's responsible gets put in that responsible position and the other people are forced to follow it. The problem is a lot of people can't see the broader picture. So they're only doing their job. So this says, if it happens that you need to get this person to do the job, there are limits to how far you can push them. You need to be careful about this. Look at verse 26. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. In other words, you better not be wielding a stick around beating that guy, because you take out an eye and he walks free no matter what he owes, no matter what his job is. So you want to be careful about what you do. If he knocks a tooth out of his male or female slave, he will go free on account of his tooth. In other words, the point that God was making is, yes, you have the right to discipline these people while they're your indentured servants, but you better be careful, because if you hurt them in certain ways, they get to walk. So you do not want to push this too far. Now, on the first reading, that throws most people back to the images of slavery from the Old South. But the fact is, if you take a breath and look again, this is to limit and warn the business owner from the people who were the indentured servants who worked for him. So, if a business owner struck his indentured servant and killed him, he was subject to punishment that belonged to a crime of passion. Here's what I want you to see. He didn't get off. If I beat someone and they die, there's another set of laws we haven't done yet that are called crimes of passion. And those are handled differently. Premeditated murder is not the way it's handled. It's handled as a crime of passion. By the way, what's a crime of passion?
Heat of the moment, you reacted out of emotion and not clear thought.
Or burning bed syndrome. What's that? Anybody know? He abused her over a long period of time, and one day she killed him. Is that the same as premeditated murder? No, it's a crime of passion. It means that there are other circumstances that also play into the premeditation. In other words, he's abusing my child, and I kill him. Is that premeditated murder? No, it's a crime of passion. There's other prevailing circumstances that balance it. In this case, the indentured servant dying falls under crime of passion, not under premeditated murder. That's what he's saying. He's saying, and why? Because the indentured servant, for all practical purposes, is part of his family during that time. He's sleeping in his tents. He's with his own children. If the man does not discipline this servant, the children will be affected. The family will be affected, not just the productivity. We think in terms of us going home to our house and coming and driving to work. That's not the system they had. God isn't addressing 21st century America here. He's addressing a bunch of people in tents having come from 10 generations of slavery. And you got to put that in there in order to understand what he's doing. The other thing is, if the indentured servant survived the striking and it caused no injury that was permanent, there was no crime. Why? Because if you don't make that the standard and he left a red mark, you could, you know what I'm saying? You could then turn on the owner and say, you left a mark on me, I should go free. No, you didn't lose a tooth, you didn't lose an eye. There was no permanent damage there. Okay? Now, here's the thing. If you beat him so that he was really hurt, then you lost the value of your worker during his downtime, which is just plain stupid on your part. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to say it's counterproductive to wound your workers, but let me also make sure that the worker knows that discipline can happen in their life. Does this make sense to you, what he's trying to do? In a barter economy, he's giving them worker protections. And in the modern sense, people walk around going, well, they were for slavery. They don't get it. In a barter economy of 10 generations of slaves, he was giving them the first things they've ever heard on worker protection. They have never had worker protection before. So that's the point of the passage. The length and the severance and the retention and the discipline standards are in order for male workers. Now, I skipped over a part that is 7 to 11, and this one is even harder to discern. And that is the bride of price. The bride of price is, if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, and she is not to go free as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these three things, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. What in the world is going on here? This is a bride of price contract. And I know what it looks like, and if I were one of the girls sitting here, I'd be sitting here going, what? If my dad sold me into slavery? This is not dial-a-girl. There's something else going on here. This is not ordering a wife from a catalog. That's not what's going on. We live in an oversexed modern world that quickly goes to the lust of men. This isn't about lust at all. Sex is in it, but lust isn't. This isn't what it's about. This is, I got to take you back to their time and their world for you to understand. Okay, I want to read something to you, see if this helps you. Imagine a tribe long ago that was brutally overthrown by a ruler that they had come to trust. There came about a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. Imagine that ruler placed them in bondage, and taking from them the opportunity to follow the teachings of their fathers, they became forced labor pool for a dictator. That's what happened. Fast forward 10 generations. No one recalls the freedoms of their ancestors from long before. Imagine that God called a man and his family to revive his witness and to turn God's people out of that land of that dictator. But all of them had been slaves. So the only economic reality they knew was indentured service. They didn't use money, they used barter. And their services of their hands and feet became a trade commodity like paper or credit cards. I can't give you money, but I can give you 5 years of service for my daughter. That's what I can pay you. I don't have anything else. All of a sudden, they had jewelry, fine clothing, gold, silver, and no place to spend it. 10 generations of slaves, and they are loaded down with goods on their way out of Egypt, and they don't know what to do with it because they actually have never had any. I want you to think not as an American, not as a 21st century person. I want you to think what would happen if your father and your father's father and your father's father's father had been a slave. That's all you ever knew. You owned nothing. You all of a sudden are given lots of stuff. Would you know how to deal with it? Would you know what to do with the stuff? No. So these people are from large tribes of a single family. But the numbers had now outgrown their way, and everywhere they looked, people who lived next door were technically part of their family, but the bloodline was so far away that there was no danger there. They were distant cousins. This is a traveling group of 50,000 cousins. I mean, that's pretty hard to conceive, but 50,000 cousins who have all been slaves. Every single one of them had been slaves, raised in slavery, under slaves, with parents who had been slaves, with grandparents who had been slaves. That's what you have to understand when you're looking at this. And at the same time, in order to meet the demands of a very high infant mortality rate and life expectancy was low, they averaged over half of those who were born died young. That means you have to have 3 children to get 1. Okay? That's what it means. I want you to put that together. They had differing contractual relationships that were designed so that they could keep going. Why did God allow polygamy among the Israelites? Because there wouldn't be Israelites if he didn't. The fact is the infant mortality rate was so great and the lifespans were so short that it was the only way to keep the race going. Today we have medical care to compensate. They didn't have hygiene. They didn't have medical care. They didn't know about bacteria. So God allowed them a system that worked for them. Does that mean that God didn't care? No, it meant that they had a system that worked for them. Does that mean it was a good system? No. Read Jacob's life. The multiple wives made multiple mess. It wasn't a good system. It was just better than dying off, is what I'm saying. Now, let's go now take apart this law for the woman, and then we'll take a break. Verse 7. If a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. Girls, can I just admit right up front that if I were you, I'd look at this and go, yeah, this is a verse I'd like to not have in the Bible. It'd be better if we didn't have it, but that's not true. Tom needs a new plow to break the ground for the crops in the next season. His was a simple, broken plow, and it was beyond repair. And Tom approached Ed, the local blacksmith and plow maker, and he walked down to the tent down the way and said, Ed, going to need a plow. Now he saw that Ed had 3 girls from his wife, but she seemed unable to give him sons. And he needed sons to grow his business into a place where both he and his wife would be secure in their old age, if they made it to their old age. So Tom pulled Ed aside and offered him to present his young daughter Susie as a second wife to bear children with Ed. Why? You all understand what he's doing? Your wife's only producing you daughters, and that's fine, but that's not going to get you what you need. You need another blacksmith. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you my daughter, and Ed, you can have babies with my daughter, and those babies might be sons. Because even then they understood it was a combination thing, okay? They didn't get the whole genetics, but they understood combinations. So, in this way, Ed would supply the plow, and Tom would be able to supply his daughter as payment so that Tom would have crops the next season, and Ed would grow his family business, and everybody would come out the same. Susie was considered a bride of price. Sometimes verse 7 should be concubine. It's a word for bride of price. It means that it's not the same as Ed's first wife and his family. This is a girl that's to provide something or pay for something. Does that make sense? Now, what you should know about this situation is Tom's not walking around with a catalog of daughters and selling them off. That's not what he's doing. Ed, by the way, is not shopping for extra sex partners. That's not what he's doing. More sex means more babies means more provision. From Ed's perspective, a baby comes into the world and it may cost him the woman that bore the baby, she may die. The baby probably will die. 1 out of 3 will live. Okay? So we're looking at this from 21st century eyes, but we're not seeing it for what it is. What does 21:7 do? It's intended to be a protection for Susie. How does it protect her? The bride of price contract was made to be a permanent arrangement, unlike the 6-year temporary servant cycle for a man. Why?
Girls had less ways to make money.
They had very few ways to make money. She has only a few productive years of her life, and the primary thing that she will be able to give someone is babies. Now, I don't like that. I happen to think you're all intelligent and you can give a whole lot more to the world than babies. I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm suggesting I wasn't living several thousand years before Jesus. I'm living now. We have hygiene. We have other things you can contribute, ladies. You can be a computer programmer or president of the United States. I don't have a problem with the difference. I'm saying that they didn't live when we live. They lived when they lived, and this law was for them. Verse 8. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. Is that good or bad for the lady? Okay, let me go back and say, if Ed finished the work on the plow, he took Susie home to the tent where Ed and Ann lived with their 3 girls. Susie entered the tent to bear children as his second wife. This was all lawful. It was all completely moral at the time. God had never said it wasn't. To shade it as something less than moral is wrong. God didn't tell them it was wrong. They were doing something to keep each other alive. That's what they knew. Now, Ed and Susie try to have children together, attempting multiple times. Meanwhile, Susie's young and she's contentious and she's stubborn and she makes Ed's household life terrible, and Ann cannot take it. Ann's girls are becoming infected with stubborn willfulness. So Ed decided that Susie was not a suitable woman to raise his son, if they ever had one, and he cut her loose to send her home. He couldn't get the plow back because the deal was legally consummated on both sides. He can't say, I don't like the daughter, I want my plow back. Tom's using the plow and has traded his daughter in. He's made payment. The fact that the daughter is not right in Ed's eyes doesn't mean that Tom gets his plow taken away. Are we all on that page? Okay, that's what's going on here. The law provided that he could simply not fire her and take back his stuff. There were rules. First, he had to present her back to Tom, her original nuclear family. Under no circumstances could Ed make any deal to exchange her with any other group, an outside group. The party of the covenant was Tom and his daughter Susie and Ed and Ann. Ed can't take Susie and give her to somebody else. That's what he's saying. He's saying, now if you find that she's not right, or this is not working out, you can take her back to her original family, but you can't give her to somebody else. That's what he's saying. Ed was to protect Susie for Tom's family. It was bound to make a substantial loss because of his poor ability to choose, and the shame was brought to Susie because of Susie's character. But here's the point. If that's what happens, there's a way to remedy the situation that is going to protect Susie so that she's not a piece of meat traded around to make babies. She has protection. Now, look at verse 9. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. So if Ed made the plow to get a wife for Joe, his son, Susie is going to now marry Joe, Ed had no right to treat her as property, but is to treat her as a daughter. In other words, this is a protection to Susie. In spite of the fact that he's worked long and hard to secure her for Joe, the fact is she was to be Joe's wife and her body was to be respected as Joe's wife. Ed made payment as a dad and he was to treat her as a father and never touch that girl. So this isn't property in the sense that she's a community property and we can all sleep with her. No, that's not how this works. There are rules to it. Now look at verse 10. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. I know it's hard, girls, to think, why does she want to sleep with the guy and have babies with the guy if he takes another wife and doesn't even love her? Because she has nothing else she can raise capital with. This is the one way she can make money. So by having a child, you are in effect giving yourself a retirement. You have nowhere to go, ladies. If let's say after this Tom dies, he got his plow, but he died. There's no home to go back to. Now what's she going to do? There has to be protections under law to not leave her destitute. All of these laws were not to be to a disadvantage to the woman. They were to protect the woman. But now, in our modern times, with modernity, we can turn this around and make it look like they're trying to keep them barefoot and pregnant and sell them into slavery as sex slaves, and the Bible's for this. Read CNN blogs, and that's what people are saying the Bible is for. You know, the Quran and the Bible are just the same because the Bible did the same. No, it didn't. No, it didn't. It protected the woman. The whole purpose of this was to protect her. Verse 11. If he will not do these three things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. At the very least, she gets set free. At the very least. But better that she would stay under the system and be able to take advantage of the system and gain and grow because of what she's put into it. By the way, that law is later amended in the Deuteronomic law that she gets to take the children with her. And that's a huge thing. Why? Because you're not going to cut her loose and then take what was from her. You're not going to take the advantage of her and then cut her loose. You're not doing that. Because already under the law in the States, some women were being cut loose without any covering and without any way to make anything, too old to have babies and having left their babies behind with him. That became inequitable, and so they had to amend the law. Does that make sense? Girls, I just need for all of you to understand this because you're going to hear this more and more and more as the Bible gets thrown under the bus with the Quran. You're going to hear this over, you're going to hear this line of argumentation, and you need to be able to understand how the Bible is specifically different than that. The biblical setting for this was to get slaves into a free society, not to get free people into slavery. Okay? That's not what it was intended to do. So how does this help you with values in the modern family? Okay? Can we all agree that none of you girls are going to have any of these situations? This isn't going to come up in your life and you don't have to worry about it. So now you're looking at rules for somebody you're not. How does this help you? Let's say that's your devotions for this morning. You have read now 21, 7 to 11. You have read about the bride of Christ. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. Why do you care? Let me give you a couple things. First, God was keenly interested in developing wholesome families. He was aware of the needs of people to procreate, but he set strict boundaries around committing adultery. So even in a system where one guy was sleeping with several different women, there was still a law of adultery. What does that tell you? They did not view this system as one thing. They viewed it as two different things. In other words, you didn't necessarily have babies with someone out of love. Sometimes you did it out of preservation of a family. That's what you did. You were just trying to stay alive. Sexual purity was always part of God's thinking. Make no mistake about it. But let me go to a second one. Women were to be protected by civil society because God said so. There was never a time when human ingenuity was to devise a system that took away her rights. There was never a time. Third, before a man could have a woman as his wife, he had to show that he was willing to earn the right to be a husband. I think that's an important statement. What a concept. He actually has to earn the right to have her. I think that's pretty good, ladies, and I think you should camp on that one. So, all right, as long as you guys are on that page, I'm going to move past you. Ben?
Paul comes around and starts writing the New Testament. There is the distinction that it's one man, one woman. So is that is in your, or just in general, directly connected to the change in the society as far as survival is concerned?
Yes.
There was a civilization that could exist with...
I think part of it was that. I think part of it was the context of the Roman world versus the world of the desert and the ancient Egyptian healthcare system. I think part of it was that. But the other part of it is, although Paul, Jesus, and then again Paul in a more profound way, Paul did not support multiple wives. He understood that some believers were coming to faith while operating as pleasurable service women. And he took away from them the guilt of that. In other words, there were situations. If you're a slave working in a brothel, you're a sex slave working in a brothel, and you come to Jesus Christ, you can't get out from underneath of it if you can't buy your way out. So he addresses in 1 Corinthians 7, do not feel bad about it. Don't take no thought of it. This isn't your fault. And so he took that off of them. I think that each writer is dealing with the issues of their time. And when the Bible is taken as a whole, that's the reason why I think, look, guys, people will say to you, what does the Bible teach about divorce? And this is what they'll do. They'll say, well, what you do is you go to Deuteronomy 24 and because of an uncleanness in her, and then you go to Malachi and God hates divorce, and then you go to Matthew 5 and 19 and except for the clause of fornication, and then you go to 1 Corinthians 7, and this is what the Bible says about divorce. That is exactly wrong. You can't jump from the desert to the Roman world and make it one thing. It's what did God say in this circumstance with this set of laws with this prevailing problem? What did he, and what's the principle? What did he say here? What's the principle? What did he say here? What's the principle? Now put the principles together. That's how you do it. And the problem is that's not how we're teaching people to do it. We're teaching people to do it with using a bullet point fortune cookie Bible of spin the wheel. God says he's against tattoos, but he's against ham, except for now that I'm a Christian, he's for ham, but he's still against tattoos because I don't like tattoos. That's what we're doing. And that's why everybody's jumbled up on how the Bible works.